Before we get into tonight's story, a huge thank you to some of the people who made this one happen. Sarah, Thomas, Stuart, Kristen, Dylan, Robert and Brian. You requested this, and honestly, it is one of the most fascinating rabbit holes we have gone down on this channel. Your curiosity drives everything we do here, and we are so grateful you are part of this community. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's talk about Project Silvanus. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a forest just before something extraordinary happens. Hunters know it. Rangers know it. The logging crews who worked the Olympic Peninsula in the autumn of 1983 knew it in their bones long before they understood what it meant. It is a silence that is not the absence of sound so much as the withdrawal of it, as if every creature within a mile radius simultaneously decides that stillness is the only reasonable response to whatever has just entered their world. The birds stop calling. The insects halt their rhythmic scraping. The wind, even the wind, seems to reconsider. And then, in that hollow cathedral of quiet, something moves. The Olympic National Forest in Washington State is one of the last genuinely wild places in the contiguous United States. It encompasses nearly 1 million acres of old-growth temperate rainforest, alpine meadow, glacier, and coastline. The trees there are not merely large, they are ancient in a way that makes the word feel insufficient. Sitka spruce reaching 200 feet into the permanent overcast. Douglas fir with trunks wider than the span of 3 grown men with their arms extended. Mosses that have been growing on the same fallen log since before the Declaration of Independence was signed. This is a place that does not easily give up its secrets, and for most of recorded history it kept the greatest one of all without anyone being entirely certain there was a secret to keep. The logging crew operating in Grid Section 44 of the Olympic Peninsula that October was a team of 7 men contracted through a timber management company out of Aberdeen, Washington. Their work that week was routine. Survey, mark, begin preliminary clearing on a stretch of secondary growth adjacent to a protected old-growth corridor. The morning of October the 12th, 1983, began like every other morning at that elevation in that season. Cold, grey, saturated with the particular Pacific Northwest dampness that works its way through every layer of clothing regardless of quality. The crew chief, a man named Gerald Harwick who had worked this peninsula for 19 years, noted in his personal log that the fog that morning was unusually dense, sitting low between the trees and shifting curtains that reduced visibility to perhaps 30 or 40 feet in any direction. They heard it before they saw it. That much every man in the crew would later agree upon, though the circumstances under which they agreed were not public, and the people to whom they gave their accounts were not journalists or wildlife researchers. They heard a sound unlike anything they had encountered in a combined 112 years of outdoor labour. It was not precisely a vocalisation, not in the way a bear or elk vocalises. It was lower than that, and it carried a quality of resonance that seemed less like a sound passing through air and more like a vibration moving through the ground itself. Several of the men reported feeling it in their chests before their ears registered it. One described it later as similar to the lowest note a pipe organ could produce, felt rather than heard, emanating from somewhere ahead in the fog. Gerald Harwick was the first to see it clearly. He had moved perhaps 15 feet ahead of the rest of the crew to inspect a survey marker when the fog shifted and opened. For a period he estimated at between 4 and 6 seconds into something approaching visibility. What he saw standing at the tree line on the far side of a shallow drainage ditch was not a bear. He knew bears. He had encountered black bears and brown bears in these woods across nearly 2 decades of work. What he saw was bipedal. It stood on 2 legs with a stability and stillness that suggested it was not merely pausing from quadrupedal movement, but that 2 legs were its natural and practiced posture. His estimation of its height, given later under circumstances that required complete confidentiality, was between 9 and 9.5 feet. Its build was massive in a way that the word massive only approximates, dense through the chest and shoulders in a manner that suggested not fat but an extraordinary concentration of muscle, beneath a coat of dark hair that was matted and thick across every visible surface of its body. It looked at him. He was certain of this. Whatever other uncertainties he carried about what he had seen that morning, the quality of being looked at was not among them. It regarded him for those 4 to 6 seconds with an attention that he described as evaluative, as if it were assessing something about him and finding the assessment conclusive. Then the fog closed again, and it was gone. Not running. Gone. The sound ceased. The birds did not immediately return. The crew spent the next 40 minutes in various states of shock and argument before Gerald Hurrick made the decision to radio the nearest ranger station. The wildlife disturbance report filed by Ranger Patricia Olson at the Olympic National Park Ranger Station later that afternoon was a document of careful professional restraint. She had spoken to the crew. She had observed that all 7 men corroborated the same basic facts. She noted the time, the location, the general description provided. Her training required her to log it as a wildlife sighting of undetermined species, and this is precisely what she did. What her training did not require, and what she did anyway because she was thorough, and because something in the accounts of 7 experienced outdoorsmen unsettled her in a way she could not immediately articulate, was to notify the regional supervisor and request that someone with more wildlife expertise conduct a follow-up assessment. She did not expect what followed. Within 24 hours of filing her report, 3 unmarked helicopters, not Park Service, not Forest Service, not any agency she could identify by their markings, which were limited to numerical sequences she did not recognise, arrived at the ranger station. The men who disembarked were in civilian clothing but carried themselves with a posture and economy of movement that she recognised as military. They did not introduce themselves with full names. The man who spoke with her gave her a single surname, which she would later describe as possibly a pseudonym, and presented credentials from an office within the Department of the Interior that she had never heard of and which she subsequently could not locate in any official directory of federal agencies. The section of forest where the sighting had occurred was closed within 12 hours of the helicopter's arrival. The stated reason, communicated to the ranger station through official channels, was a wildfire containment precaution related to an electrical storm system moving through the region. There had been no electrical storm. Ranger Olson noted the discrepancy in a private journal she kept separate from her official records. She noted something else as well. The closure extended not just around the drainage ditch area where the sighting had occurred, but across a radius that she calculated at approximately 4 miles in each direction from that central point. This was not a wildfire precaution. This was a perimeter. What she could not have known, and what would not become even fragmentarily apparent for 2 decades, was that the perimeter existed because the men in the helicopters were not searching for something that might still be there. They already knew, from instrumentation she had no awareness of, precisely where it was and where it was going. The United States Geological Survey maintains a network of seismic monitoring stations throughout the Pacific Northwest, designed primarily for earthquake and volcanic activity detection. The stations are sensitive enough to register surface disturbances at remarkably fine scales. The data from 3 stations in the Olympic Peninsula region, covering the period from approximately 2 in the morning to 6:40 in the morning on October 12th, showed something that the standard analysis software flagged as anomalous, and referred to a human analyst who, in turn, referred it to a supervisor who, in turn, made a phone call to a number that did not appear in any standard directory. The seismic data showed a pattern of ground impacts consistent with bipedal locomotion. This in itself was not unusual. Humans move bipedally through forests all the time, and the sensors could register that. What distinguished these impacts was threefold. The weight distribution was substantially beyond the range consistent with human locomotion, falling instead in a range that the analyst's notes described as consistent with an erect primate of extraordinary mass. The stride symmetry was perfect in a way that was unusual even for trained human movement, a complete left-right regularity that bore no resemblance to the rolling, compensating gait of ursine movement, which was the only other candidate a standard analyst would have considered, and the pattern of movement extended across a 4-mile corridor that ended, as of the last registered impact, at a point deep enough in the old-growth forest that the analyst had flagged it as a dead end, a dense grove of old-growth fir with no obvious egress. The military convoy that arrived at the access road to grid section 44 at approximately 11:30 that night was not officially military, but the equipment they unloaded over the 1940s was not the same as the equipment they unloaded over the 1940s. But the equipment they unloaded over the course of the next 3 hours, and the efficiency and precision with which they deployed across a wilderness terrain in darkness, spoke to a level of operational planning and physical conditioning that bore no resemblance to any civilian agency. By dawn, whatever they had come to do was complete. The convoy departed. The perimeter remained. 2 weeks later, the wildfire containment closure was quietly lifted. No fire had occurred. No explanation was offered for the closure's removal. Ranger Olson's wildlife disturbance report was reclassified internally as a routine false alarm attributable to equipment misidentification by civilian contractors and removed from the active database. She kept her journal. She kept her doubts. She retired 8 years later without ever publicly discussing what she had observed in October of 1983. The document that would later become the central artifact of the entire Project Silvanus archive was a 3-page internal memorandum generated on October 14, 1983, under the letterhead of an office within the Department of Defense whose full name was the Biological Anomaly Containment Initiative. The BACI was not a widely known program. Its existence, to the extent that it existed on paper at all, was buried within the administrative structure of a larger and more legitimate research division that dealt with agricultural and environmental biosecurity threats. This was by design. The BACI had been established in 1978, following a series of unexplained biological encounters in remote wilderness regions across the western United States. Encounters that were significant enough, in the assessment of certain analysts, to justify a standing response capability, but sensitive enough that no formal public acknowledgement was considered appropriate or desirable. The October 14th memorandum activated the BACI's highest operational tier. It designated the subject of the Olympic Peninsula incident as Specimen A. It outlined 3 immediate objectives in language that was clipped, technical, and entirely devoid of the kind of astonishment that a reader encountering it decades later might expect. The first objective was secure transport of Specimen A to a designated inland holding facility. The second was initiation of a full anatomical assessment protocol. The third was establishment of behavioural observation parameters to be conducted under controlled conditions. The memorandum described Specimen A in terms that read like a military equipment specification. Dense musculature, consistent with sustained load-bearing locomotion. Thick dermal tissue suggesting adaptation to environmental exposure. Vocalization range extending into infrasonic frequencies below the threshold of standard human hearing. Neural mass estimated via field assessment at substantially elevated levels relative to known great ape species. There was no wonder in the language. There was no awe. There was only the flat procedural certainty of a bureaucracy that had encountered something extraordinary and was determined to process it as efficiently as a requisition form. The holding facility to which Specimen A was transported was located in a remote stretch of northern Idaho that had been, in its public documentation, a forestry research outpost operated jointly by the Forest Service and a private environmental consulting firm. The consulting firm was a shell organisation. The Forest Service designation was genuine but hollow. The station appeared in agency records, received modest annual budget allocations that were never questioned, and generated quarterly reports that were competently fabricated by someone with enough familiarity with forestry research methodology to make them plausible. No actual forestry research had been conducted at the site since its construction in 1979. The facility itself descended through 7 sub-levels beneath a surface structure of convincing modesty. a cluster of wooden buildings indistinguishable from the kind of modest research station that dotted remote federal land across the region. Below the surface, the architecture was something else entirely. The first sub-level housed the administrative and communications infrastructure, server banks, radio equipment, a direct encrypted line to the Washington office that managed BACI operations, and dormitory quarters for the rotating staff of approximately 30 personnel. The second sub-level contained equipment storage, vehicle maintenance, and power generation systems. The third sub-level was where the observation chambers were located, a series of reinforced enclosures with one-way viewing panels, microphone arrays calibrated for both standard and infrasonic frequency ranges, and environmental controls capable of replicating a wide range of temperature, humidity, and light conditions. The fifth sub-level was the behavioural laboratory. This was where, over the course of the years that followed, researchers would conduct the experiments that would eventually shatter their professional frameworks and force a reclassification so significant that it generated an internal crisis that never reached the public. The sixth sub-level housed the genetic sequencing unit, which in 1983 was equipped with the most advanced DNA analysis technology available, technology that was, even by the standards of that era, extraordinarily expensive and not widely accessible outside of the highest funded research institutions. The seventh sub-level was accessed by a single elevator that required two simultaneous key authorizations from personnel of senior classification, and its purpose and contents were known only to those whose names appeared on a list that was itself classified at a level requiring specific executive authorization to view. Specimen A arrived at the facility on October 17, 1983, transported in a custom-fabricated containment unit that the transport logs described only as Unit C7. The transport had required 4 vehicles, 3 escort personnel per vehicle, and had taken place entirely at night along routes that avoided all population centres. The subject had been sedated for transport. The sedation protocol itself had been a significant challenge, given that the standard dosages used for large primate sedation had proven, in field assessment, to be insufficient, and the team had been required to administer quantities that the medical officer noted in his log as being at the outer theoretical limit of what any known primate physiology could tolerate without fatal cardiac impact. Specimen A had tolerated them. The first week of observation established the baseline behavioural parameters that would govern the research program for the next 4 years. Specimen A was contained in a chamber on the third sub-level that measured 40 feet by 60 feet, larger than most residential homes, with a ceiling height of 20 feet. The floor was packed earth brought from the Olympic Peninsula. The walls were reinforced concrete faced with natural stone. Environmental controls maintained temperature and humidity conditions approximating those of the Pacific Northwest temperate rainforest. Food was provided according to a diet that field observation had suggested was consistent with known great ape dietary patterns, supplemented with proteins that the nutritional analysis team estimated were necessary to sustain the evident metabolic requirements of a subject of this size. Specimen A in those first days did not eat. This was documented without alarm in the early observation logs. The research team had anticipated an adjustment period, and the subject's apparent physical condition suggested it could sustain prolonged periods without nutritional intake, without immediate medical risk. What the early logs did document with careful attention was behaviour. Specimen A did not pace. It did not attack the walls. It did not display the stereotypic repetitive movements that are characteristic of stress responses in captive great apes. It sat. For the first 72 hours, with intervals of sleep that the observation team documented as occurring in 2 to 3 hour cycles, it sat in the approximate centre of the chamber and appeared to observe its environment with the same evaluative attention that Gerald Harwick had described in those 4 to 6 seconds of fog-cleared visibility in grid section 44. The DNA sequencing work that began in the second week of November 1983 proceeded according to a protocol that the laboratory director, a man whose name appears in all surviving documentation only as Dr. M, had designed based on the best available analytical methodology of the period. The extraction of genetic material had required the participation of the facility's medical team and a sedation protocol that was by then somewhat more refined than the field procedure, though still operating at the outer limit of what was considered safe. The material extracted was sufficient for a comprehensive sequencing effort that, given the technology available, was expected to take several months. It took 4 months. The results, delivered to the Baki program director in late February of 1984, in a report that ran to 237 pages, were greeted with a response that the facility director later described in private correspondence as the most complete professional silence he had ever experienced in a career spanning 3 decades of classified research. The sequencing results showed that Specimen A's genetic material was 98% aligned with the human genome. This figure, which would have been extraordinary enough in isolation, was set against a baseline comparison. The chimpanzee genome shares approximately 98.7% alignment with the human genome. Specimen A was, genetically speaking, nearly as closely related to modern humans as our nearest confirmed evolutionary relatives. But the remaining 2% was where the results became something that no existing scientific framework could accommodate. The divergent genetic material did not align with any known primate species. It did not align with the genetic record of any hominin species in the paleontological database. It aligned, in partial segments, with genetic sequences that had been detected in trace amounts in certain human populations through studies that had not yet been widely published and whose implications the broader scientific community had not yet begun to grapple with. Dr. M's report concluded, with the kind of restraint that only someone who has been trained to deliver impossible information in controlled language could manage, that Specimen A represented a surviving member of an unknown hominid lineage that had diverged from the human ancestral branch approximately 200,000 years ago, and had subsequently evolved in parallel isolation from both modern humans and the known great ape lineage. The report recommended immediate reclassification of Project Silvanus from a zoological anomaly containment operation to an anthropological research initiative of the highest priority. It noted with specific emphasis that the discovery raised questions of a legal, ethical and policy nature that exceeded the competency of the research team to assess and required consultation with expertise at levels not presently engaged with the project. It noted with specific emphasis that the subject's neural mass and the implications of the genetic data suggested cognitive capacities that had not yet been behaviourally confirmed, but that warranted serious investigation. It noted, with specific emphasis, that the current containment framework had been designed for a large animal and might require significant revision in light of what the genetic data implied. The program director's response to the report was to reclassify it at a higher clearance level and to schedule a review meeting with a small group of senior officials whose names did not appear in any publicly accessible government directory. Whether that meeting occurred and what conclusions it reached is not documented in any fragment that has subsequently come to light. What is documented is that the research program continued and that it expanded. By 1985, the behavioural laboratory on the 5th sublevel had become the centre of the facility's intellectual activity. The observation team had grown to include 2 linguists, a cognitive anthropologist, a behavioural neurologist, and 3 primatologists whose prior work had been focused on great ape language acquisition research. They had come to the facility through a process that involved, in each case, an initial approach by someone representing themselves as affiliated with a private research foundation, a series of increasingly specific conversations about their area of expertise, and ultimately a briefing that each of them would later describe, in whatever private accounting they made to themselves, as the most significant moment of their professional lives. None of them had been given a choice, exactly, but none of them had refused. The behavioural data accumulating in the observation records was building a picture that the team found simultaneously exhilarating and deeply unsettling. Specimen A had, by the spring of 1985, ceased the passive observation behaviour of the initial months and had begun engaging with its environment in ways that were impossible to attribute to instinct or conditioning alone. The subject had organised the elements of the chamber, the rocks, the branches, the soil, into patterns that recurred with sufficient consistency to suggest intentionality. The patterns were not random. They were not decorative in any way the researchers could immediately interpret. They were geometric in a basic sense, regular, repeated, internally consistent, and they changed over time in ways that suggested a developing system rather than a fixed one. The vocalization analysis had by this point consumed hundreds of hours of recorded material. Specimen A produced a range of sounds that extended from frequencies well within normal human hearing into the infrasonic range below 20 Hz, where human perception does not reach but instrumentation can. The higher frequency vocalizations showed patterns that the linguists had been analysing with growing intensity. There were recurring phonemic elements. There were structural regularities that bore a functional resemblance, at a very coarse level of analysis, to the structural regularities that linguists identify in human language. Whether this constituted language in any meaningful sense was a question the team argued about with a sustained passion that the observation logs captured only obliquely, in the form of meeting minutes that noted, with diplomatic understatement, ongoing discussion regarding the interpretation of vocalization data. What ended the argument, or at least transformed it into something different, was what happened in the spring of 1986. The observation team had begun, some months earlier, a protocol that involved playing recorded human speech to Specimen A through speakers mounted in the chamber. The protocol was not intended as a language training exercise. The team had been cautious about introducing that level of intentionality into the early behavioural work, but rather as an environmental enrichment measure, an attempt to provide sensory variety that might reduce whatever stress the subject was experiencing. The recordings were of ordinary conversation, read passages, lectures. They were played at moderate volume for several hours each day. In March of 1986, Specimen A began to respond. Not to the recordings themselves, not in the sense of attempting to communicate with the speakers, but in the dust of the chamber floor, which the research team had observed the subject occasionally marking with its fingers in ways that had previously seemed random, the new behaviour emerged. The subject was drawing, not pictures, nothing that could be interpreted as representational, symbols, specific, repeating forms that appeared, disappeared, were modified, and reappeared in a sequence that suggested a working process rather than a fixed product. The team photographed them systematically. The cognitive anthropologist spent 3 weeks developing a cataloguing system. The linguist noted structural resemblances to no known writing system, but also noted that the concept of symbolic marking for communicative purpose was exactly what this appeared to be. Then came the phonemic mimicry. It began subtly, a sequence of sounds in the subject's vocalization pattern that the audio analyst flagged as possibly containing elements borrowed from the recorded human speech. Then it became less subtle. Specimen A was reproducing phonemes from the recordings with a precision that the linguist found startling, given the anatomical differences between the subject's vocal apparatus and the human vocal apparatus. It was not reproduction that produced human-sounding speech. The resonance was wrong, the quality was fundamentally different, but it was reproduction that carried enough structural resemblance to be unmistakably intentional imitation. And then, in July of 1986, during a routine observation shift at approximately 3 a.m. when the chamber was lit only by the low-level maintenance lighting that approximated nocturnal conditions, the observation technician on duty heard the subject produce a sequence of sounds that she initially transcribed phonetically as something she could not identify. She played the recording back at half speed, then at quarter speed. Then she walked down the corridor to the linguist's dormitory and knocked on the door. The linguist listened to the recording 3 times. Then he sat in silence for a long time. What Specimen A had produced, at 3 a.m. in an underground chamber in northern Idaho, was a sequence of 3 phonemic clusters that bore unmistakable resemblance to 3 English words: we, still, here. The debate about whether this constituted language whether it constituted communication, whether it constituted something that should change the entire ethical framework within which the project was operating, consumed the research team for the remaining months of 1986 and into the early weeks of 1987. The cognitive anthropologist argued that the distinction between instinctual mimicry and intentional communication was philosophically meaningful but practically difficult to establish with certainty. The behavioural neurologist argued that the neurological architecture suggested by the genetic data, the elevated neural mass, the cortical complexity that the medical team had estimated from external assessment, made intentional communication not merely possible but probable. The linguists argued that the structural characteristics of the symbol system and the phonemic sequencing together constituted a pattern of behaviour that, in any other context, they would not hesitate to characterise as language use. The program director, who visited the facility in November of 1986 for the first time since the initial activation period, listened to all of these arguments in a series of briefings that lasted 2 days. He reviewed the observation logs, he viewed the recordings, he reviewed the genetic report. He requested a written summary from each team member of their professional assessment of the subject's cognitive status. He returned to Washington and filed a report that has never been made publicly available. What changed after that report was filed was operational rather than scientific. The observation protocols were tightened, access to the subject was restricted, and the team was informed that a formal review of the project's objectives was underway at the administrative level. On March 22, 1987, at 11:47 in the evening, the facility experienced a power failure. The backup generation system, which was designed to engage within 45 seconds of primary power interruption, did not engage. The security logs, which were recovered from a separate battery-maintained system, showed that the magnetic locking mechanisms on Specimen A's containment chamber disengaged during the power interruption and remained disengaged for 2 minutes and 41 seconds before the manual override system, which required physical activation by security personnel, was engaged. By that point, the chamber was empty. The subsequent search of the facility's interior found blood traces in the corridor outside the chamber. Not a large quantity. An initial analysis was unable to establish definitively whether it was the subject's blood or human blood, though the DNA analysis that was conducted in the days that followed established that it was human. 3 members of the security personnel were missing. Their names do not appear in any public record. They were never publicly reported as missing or deceased. The official account of events at the facility, as communicated to the administrative chain above the program director, described a chemical accident in the lower levels resulting in the facility's decommissioning. The facility was officially decommissioned on April 5, 1987. No public acknowledgement of its existence was ever made. The question of how the power failure had occurred was never officially answered. The facility's engineering logs showed no mechanical failure that would have caused the outage. The backup generation system's failure to engage was attributed in the engineering report to a cascade fault in the activation circuitry, but the engineering report itself was subsequently classified at a level above the clearance of most people who had worked at the facility. What the engineering report noted, and what the people who read it found most difficult to accommodate within any standard framework of facility security assessment, was that the magnetic locks had disengaged in a sequence. Not all at once, as would have been expected from a power failure, but in a sequence. Chamber lock, corridor access point, emergency stairwell, that implied a specific navigational knowledge of the facility's security architecture. The files sat. The facility crumbled into the Idaho wilderness under a cover of progressive moss and structural decay. The people who had worked there returned to lives in which they could not, under the terms of the classified agreements they had signed, discuss what they had observed and what they had begun to understand. The program director retired. Dr. M published a series of papers on primate cognition in the late 1980s that were careful, well-regarded, and told the world nothing about what he had actually been working on. The world moved on, as it does, into the 1990s and the accelerating digital revolution that would, eventually, create the conditions for someone to go looking for what had been so carefully hidden. Mason Klein was 19 years old in 2003, living in a cramped apartment in Portland, Oregon, with 3 monitors, a collection of fast food containers, and a technical aptitude that his high school computer science teacher had described to his parents as something she had never encountered before, and was not entirely sure how to characterize. Mason had not gone to college. He had considered it, and decided that the formal education system had nothing to teach him, that he could not learn faster and more efficiently on his own, which was probably true. He operated under the online alias Root Cascade, in the communities of people who shared his interest in exploring digital systems that were not designed to be explored, not for financial gain, not for disruption, but out of a consuming intellectual hunger to understand how things worked and what they contained. His specific interest in the summer and autumn of 2003 was what he called Cold War residue, the digital traces of programs, projects and operations from the 1970s and 1980s that had been inadequately migrated during the digitization processes of the 1990s. Government agencies converting paper records to digital systems had, in many cases, been rushed, underfunded, and insufficiently attentive to the security implications of digital storage versus physical storage. Files that had spent 15 years gathering dust in rooms to which physical access was tightly controlled had been scanned, uploaded, and attached to server nodes whose security architecture reflected the priorities and threat models of the early internet era, rather than the sensitivity of their contents. Mason had been finding these residues for 2 years, working through them with a systematic patience that belied his age, and he had found things, programs, decisions, events, that he documented in encrypted private files and shared, selectively and carefully, with a small community of people who shared his interest and his commitment to discretion. In October of 2003, working through a Department of Energy server node that he had accessed through a vulnerability in its authentication system that he had identified and documented without activating for 3 months before finally deciding to use it, Mason found a folder. The path was /BIO-SLV-EIGHTY-THREE/. The folder was encrypted at a level that he recognized as significant, not the routine encryption of standard classified systems, but something that had been specifically applied, something that suggested someone had known this data might eventually be accessed without authorization, and had wanted to slow that access down considerably. He did not attempt to decrypt it immediately. He made a complete copy, exfiltrated it through a series of anonymizing relays he had been maintaining for months, and sat back in his chair and looked at the folder name for a long time. He spent 3 weeks on the encryption. It was not a continuous effort. He was careful about the time he spent actively engaged with the target system, and he had other work, other projects, the ordinary rhythms of a life lived largely online. But the encryption occupied the central attention of his technical imagination for those 3 weeks, and when it finally yielded on a Thursday afternoon in early November, when the rain was moving through Portland in sheets against his apartment windows, he found himself looking at a directory of files that made him sit very still for a long time without typing anything. The directory contained 3 major categories of material. The first was a collection of medical and anatomical documentation, imaging files, bone density scans, tissue analysis reports, the kind of material that would be generated by a comprehensive physical assessment of a biological subject. The imaging files, when Mason opened them, showed something that his mind took several seconds to process. He was looking at something that was not human, and was not any animal he had encountered in any documentary, any natural history museum, any scientific publication. The scale references in the images, the measurement markers placed in the frame by whoever had taken them, established a size that was staggering. The bone density scans showed a skeletal architecture of extraordinary robustness. The tissue analysis reports, which Mason could read only in fragments given his limited background in biological sciences, contained recurring phrases that he noted carefully. Musculature density, exceeding known primate range, dermal tissue thickness consistent with cold weather adaptation, neural mass index significantly elevated above gorilla baseline. The second category was audio. There were 47 audio files in the directory, labelled with a systematic notation that identified them as vocalization recordings from a subject designated Specimen A, recorded at a facility whose designation was given as BACI-F-1, across dates spanning from November of 1983 through February of 1987. Mason had a reasonable audio editing setup. He used it for music production, one of the several technical hobbies that occupied his considerable spare attention, and he opened the first file in his editing software and looked at the waveform before he played it. The waveform was unusual. The lower frequency content was substantially larger than would be expected from a standard vocalization recording, extending down into the infrasonic range in a way that was visible in the waveform display as a dense mass of low frequency energy surrounding the higher frequency components. Mason put on his best headphones and played the file. What he heard was something he would subsequently describe to the small group of people he trusted with this material as the most disturbing audio experience of his life, and he said this with the awareness that disturbing audio was a category he had considerable experience with. The high-frequency components resolved, filtered through the headphones, into something that was recognisable as vocalization, not speech, not any sound a human throat produces, but something that shared with human vocalization the quality of intentional modulation, of sound being shaped by will rather than released by automatic process. Layered beneath it, felt more than heard even through high-quality headphones, was the infrasonic component, a sustained low vibration that produced in him a physical unease he could not attribute to any rational source. He listened to all 47 files over the course of an evening, pausing frequently. The 12th file, labelled Specimen Vocalization 12B, was the one he returned to most frequently. In Specimen Vocalization 12B, at approximately 2 minutes and 17 seconds into the recording, there was a phonemic sequence that Mason played at half speed, then at quarter speed, then ran through an audio analysis tool that mapped phonemic content against phoneme libraries from 37 human languages. The analysis tool flagged no match against any language in its library, but it flagged structural similarity to English phonemic patterns at a confidence level that the tool's output expressed with an exactness that Mason found uncomfortable. 73% phonemic alignment with the English phonemes corresponding to the syllables of 3 words. He looked at the tool's output for a long time, then he went back to the directory and opened the third category of material. The third category was textual documentation, memos, reports, logs, correspondence. Mason read for 6 hours. He read about the Olympic Peninsula incident, about the seismic data, about the transport operation, about the facility and its sub-levels. He read the fragments of the genetic sequencing report that appeared in the directory, which were not the complete 237-page document, but excerpts that had apparently been included in a summary briefing. He read the behavioural observation logs through the end of 1985 and into 1986. He read the linguist's notes. He read the observation technician's 3 a.m. shift report from July of 1986. He read the fragments of the internal debate about cognitive status. And then, at the end of the directory, he found the final file. The final file was dated April 2nd, 1987. It was a transfer order. The subject line was relocation to secondary site, Northern Range. The body of the memo was brief and operational in the same flat bureaucratic register as every other document in the directory. Specimen A was to be relocated from BACI-F-1 to a secondary containment facility designated BACI-F-7. The coordinates of BACI-F-7 were partially redacted. The latitude and longitude were each obscured by a block of black that the document's digitization had preserved faithfully. But the memo included a regional description that was not redacted. Northern Range referred to a specific geographic designation that Mason recognized from his familiarity with federal land management terminology as a designation used for remote mountainous areas in the northern Rocky Mountain region. He had a geographic information system tool on his second monitor. He pulled it up and began to work. The regional description in the memo, combined with the infrastructure requirements it implied, vehicle access capable of accommodating the transport unit described elsewhere in the directory, proximity to federal land for surface concealment, adequate distance from any population centre for acoustic isolation, narrowed the geographic range considerably. When Mason cross-referenced the remaining coordinate fragments, the partial latitude and longitude information that the redaction had not completely obscured, the resulting probability map pointed with uncomfortable specificity to a region of remote mountain terrain in central Montana, east of the Bitterroot Range, in an area that was largely federal wilderness land with no registered structures and no public access. He sat with this for 3 days before he decided what to do about it. The decision, when he made it, was characteristically Mason. He would go and look. He would document what he found. He would not, at this stage, share the full archive with anyone, not because he feared for his own safety exactly, but because he understood, with a seriousness that his 19-year-old exterior might have led casual observers to underestimate, that what he had found was not primarily a story to be told, but a reality to be verified. The story could come later, if the verification warranted it. The drive from Portland to the Montana location took 2 days. Mason travelled with a printed set of schematics that he had derived from the infrastructure descriptions in the directory, a handheld Geiger counter that he had purchased online from a scientific equipment reseller, a camcorder with low-light capability that represented the best consumer-grade equipment available in 2004, and a level of physical preparedness for wilderness travel that was, he would later acknowledge, not commensurate with the terrain he was proposing to cover. He drove north and east through Idaho, through landscapes that shifted from the lush green complexity of the Cascades watershed into the drier, more austere beauty of the Rocky Mountain interior, and he arrived at the closest public road to his target location on a grey afternoon in early spring when the mountain passes still carried snow and the access roads off the main highway were still marked with seasonal closure signs. He left his car at a Forest Service staging area and walked. The terrain was more demanding than his preparation had anticipated, but he was young and stubborn, and the coordinates he had derived were pulling him forward with a force that was not entirely rational. He walked for most of a day, following a route he had plotted using topographic maps, climbing through mixed conifer forests that grew denser and more complex as he gained elevation. On the afternoon of his second day of walking, he found what he was looking for. It did not look like much. In the 2 decades since the facility's official decommissioning, the wilderness had conducted its patient, thorough reclamation project. What remained visible at the surface was a concrete foundation structure, partially collapsed, that might have passed for the remains of an old mining operation or a failed homestead. The vegetation around it had the particular quality of growth that occurs when plants are colonizing disturbed earth. Vigorous, varied, slightly unnatural in its composition compared to the surrounding forest. Mason photographed everything systematically, and then, working carefully around the perimeter of the foundation structure, he found the ventilation shafts. There were 3 of them, positioned at intervals that corresponded to the facility layout he'd constructed from the directory schematics. They were capped with heavy steel gratings that had been bolted in place, and had then been colonized by moss and lichen until they were barely distinguishable from the surrounding rock. 2 of them were completely impassable. The third had a grating that had partially failed. One of the bolts had corroded through, and the grating could be moved enough to allow someone of Mason's build to examine the shaft below. What he found below the grating was a tunnel entrance, not the shaft itself, which was too narrow for a person, but an adjacent space that the collapse of the surrounding structure had opened into a cramped but navigable crawlway. He turned on his flashlight and went in. He did not go far. The tunnel was unstable in ways that his lack of structural engineering expertise prevented him from fully assessing, but that communicated their danger through sounds and sensations that required no expertise to understand. The groan of stressed concrete, the give of compromised ground underfoot. He went in far enough to confirm that the tunnel descended. that it was not merely a crawl space but a real passageway, and that beyond the range of his flashlight the darkness was complete and total. He found, on the floor of the tunnel at the farthest point he could safely reach, a piece of metal plating that bore, barely legible under layers of corrosion, a numerical designation, BF7. The Geiger counter, which he had been operating throughout the site survey, registered readings that were above background level, but below the threshold that the instrument's documentation characterized as a health risk. Minimal but detectable, consistent with the kind of residual low-level contamination that persists around facilities that have used certain categories of scientific equipment. He photographed the readings. He photographed everything. And then, as the afternoon began to fade toward evening, he set up his camp at a careful distance from the foundation structure and settled in for the night with the recordings from his camcorder, playing back on a small monitor and his notebook filling with observations. He heard the wood knocking at approximately 11:30 that evening. He had been by that point awake for 19 hours and running on a level of alertness that adrenaline maintains long after ordinary fatigue would have won. The knocking was rhythmic. 3 impacts, a pause, 3 impacts, a pause, and it was coming from a direction that his spatial orientation placed somewhere downslope of his camp, in the deeper forest below the ridgeline where the old-growth trees were at their thickest, and the canopy closed overhead into a near-solid ceiling. He picked up the camcorder and turned it toward the sound. The subsequent vocalization lasted approximately 40 seconds. It began as the low-frequency resonance that he recognized from audio file 12B. Not precisely the same, not a recording, but the same essential quality of sound-filling space below the threshold of comfortable hearing and above the threshold of complete inaudibility. It then shifted upward in frequency into something that shared the fundamental character of the Olympic Peninsula recordings without replicating them precisely. And within that vocalization, if he strained his perception against the limits of what was there to perceive, were phonemic elements that his brain insisted on interpreting as deliberate, even as his rational mind offered alternative explanations that he could not quite make himself accept. The camcorder's low-light mode was functioning at its operational limit in the darkness of that forest, and what it captured in the tree line at the edge of the light cone was something that Mason would spend a considerable amount of time subsequently analysing and reanalyzing with every enhancement tool available to him. A silhouette, stationary, at a height and proportion that was not consistent with any animal he could identify. Too tall for a bear in any posture, too broad for a moose, too still for the restless nervous movement that characterises large ungulates in proximity to an unknown presence. It stood between 2 trees for approximately 8 seconds, and then it was not there anymore. Not a departure that the camera captured, but an absence that replaced a presence in the space between one frame and the next. He did not sleep for the remainder of that night. He broke camp at first light and began the walk back to his vehicle, moving faster than the walk in, driven by something that was not precisely fear, but that occupied the same physiological register. He drove back to Portland without stopping except for fuel and coffee, and he spent the next 2 weeks in a state of focused, urgent, analytical work that he later described as the most productive period of his technical life, and also as the period during which he slept the least and ate the most irregularly. The genetic data fragments in the directory, extracted from the sequencing report summaries, were the element he had been most uncertain about his ability to analyse independently. His expertise was digital, not biological, but he knew people. His online network included at its edges individuals whose expertise extended into bioinformatics, the application of computational methods to biological data. He reached one of these individuals through a series of layered communications that preserved the anonymity of both parties, and he transmitted the genetic data fragments without context, asking only for an analysis of the sequence characteristics. The response came back over the course of 2 weeks, in installments that the bioinformatician described as reflecting the iterative nature of the analysis, rather than any reluctance to engage. The analysis was conducted without awareness of the source or context of the data. The bioinformatician was working on what he believed to be an interesting anomalous sequence that a colleague had passed along from an archival project. His conclusions, delivered with the careful hedging that a trained scientist applies to results that fall outside the range of expected outcomes, were the following. The sequence contained human chromosome markers with high confidence. It contained a region of what he termed novel insertion, genetic material that did not correspond to any known primate genome and could not be attributed to sequencing artifact with the information available. His tentative interpretation, offered with explicit acknowledgement of the limitations imposed by partial data, was that the sequence represented either a previously undescribed human population variant or, more provocatively, a member of a divergent hominid lineage that had evolved in relative isolation from the lineage leading to modern humans. The phrase relative isolation echoed through Mason's analysis for days afterward. Not a relic, not a holdover from a prehistoric era, frozen in evolutionary time while the rest of the hominin family diverged around it. A parallel lineage, something that had been evolving on its own trajectory for 200,000 years, developing in its own direction, accumulating its own adaptations, building its own cognitive and cultural architecture in the dark of the temperate rainforest, while the lineage that became Homo sapiens was doing all the things that Homo sapiens did, crossing oceans, building cities, developing writing systems, classifying species, and failing to recognize the existence of a cousin whose territory they had been encroaching upon for millennia. Mason spent a long time thinking about the question of why, not why it had been kept secret. That part he understood, in the transactional sense of governmental risk management and institutional reputation. The harder question was what the secret protected that was more important than the truth, and the more he thought about it, the more he arrived at an answer that was less comfortable than the simple cynicism of institutional self-protection. If specimen A was what the genetic data implied, a surviving member of an intelligent, culturally coherent hominid lineage, then its capture and containment in 1983 was not merely an unusual scientific event. It was, depending on the cognitive and legal framework one applied, something closer to an imprisonment. The phrase cultural memory, used in the behavioural observation logs in reference to the subject's repetition of three-syllable phonemic sequence, had a weight that its author had noted without fully examining. Cultural memory implies a culture. A culture implies a community. A community implies, in any ethical framework that Mason had ever encountered, certain rights and protections that the Project Silvanus documentation had conspicuously not acknowledged. The motive for the cover-up was not, therefore, merely about protecting the government from embarrassment at having run an unauthorised biological containment program on federal land. It was about something more fundamental. If the existence of this species were publicly acknowledged, the entire legal and ethical architecture governing how humans relate to the non-human world would require immediate and comprehensive revision. Species rights, territorial rights, cognitive personhood, all of these were areas of law and ethics that were, in 2004, already subject to significant academic and activist debate. A confirmed surviving non-human hominid with demonstrated language use and apparent cultural transmission would not be a contribution to that debate. It would be the conclusion of it. Every national park, every wilderness area, every federally managed forest land in the Pacific Northwest region would become contested territory in ways that had no legal precedent. The program had been, Mason concluded, less about understanding what Specimen A was, and more about controlling what the knowledge of Specimen A would mean if it escaped the facility. And then, working through the final layers of the directory in the third week after his return from Montana, he found the document that changed his understanding of the entire architecture of the project. It was dated 2001. It had been added to the directory, a directory that had otherwise been frozen in content since 1987, by someone with access to the Baki administrative system 16 years after the facility's official decommissioning. The document was a surveillance report. Its header identified it as an ongoing monitoring assessment from something designated the Silvanus Continuity Office. a designation that appeared nowhere else in the directory, and that Mason subsequently spent several weeks attempting to locate in any government organisational chart without success. The report stated in the same flat operational language as every other document in the directory that Specimen A's status was confirmed active. It stated that migration patterns consistent with the subject's established behavioural profile had been confirmed across a 3-state corridor encompassing Idaho, Montana, and the interior of British Columbia, and then it stated the sentence that Mason read 3 times in succession before accepting that he had read it correctly. Analysis of infrared satellite surveillance data for the monitoring corridor identified an estimated total of between 37 and 62 distinct thermal signatures consistent with Specimen A's parameters observed across the monitoring period. Not one specimen, not an isolated survivor. Between 37 and 62 individuals moving through the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest interior in patterns that the monitoring report described as consistent with a functioning social group. What the government had captured in 1983 had not been the last of its kind. It had been one member of a population that had been living in the region all along, and that had been living in the region still, invisible to all but the most sophisticated surveillance technology and the most classified analytical frameworks. Mason went back to the directory one more time, looking now with different eyes at the documents he had already read, and he found what he had missed the first time through, because it had seemed like an unremarkable technical detail, rather than the key to the entire project. In the relocation files from April of 1987, the transfer order that had directed Specimen A to the Montana location, there was a medical note appended by the facility's veterinary officer. The note described, in brief clinical language, a procedure conducted the day before transport, the subcutaneous implantation of a tracking device. The tracking device operated on an ultrasonic frequency that the note specified with precision. The frequency was not in any range that standard wildlife tracking equipment operated in. It was specific, unusual, and, the note observed, in what now read as a significant understatement, compatible with the existing monitoring infrastructure of the Silvanus continuity network. They had not lost Specimen A in the 1987 facility breach. The tracking device ensured that they had never lost Specimen A. The breach, with its power failure and its 2 minutes and 41 seconds of open magnetic locks, had allowed the subject to leave. But the leaving had been, from the perspective of the Silvanus Continuity Office, not an escape, but a transition. From a model based on physical containment and direct study to a model based on remote monitoring and long-term observation. Project Silvanus had not ended in a failure, it had evolved. The government had spent 4 years learning what it could from direct study, had lost direct containment, and had then made a decision, perhaps implicit, perhaps explicit, perhaps simply the product of inertia and institutional convenience, to continue the project at a distance, to let the population live as it lived, in the wilderness corridors it had inhabited for 200,000 years, while maintaining the surveillance infrastructure that ensured it never entirely escaped the government's awareness. The acoustic monitoring network, which Mason spent several more weeks researching through what additional technical documentation he could locate, was the most elegant component of the architecture. The ultrasonic tracking frequency embedded in the original tracking implant had been, apparently, a frequency that the BACI researchers had discovered through their behavioural studies was within the range of frequencies that the species used for long-range communication among itself. This discovery, which was documented only in a technical footnote that Mason found buried in the monitoring report, had implications that the footnote did not elaborate, but that Mason found himself elaborating with the kind of escalating comprehension that he would have found exciting in a different context. The government had not merely tracked the individual to whom the device had been implanted. It had, by broadcasting on the communication frequency of the species, potentially influenced the movement patterns of the broader population. The acoustic monitoring network that was now distributed across the national forests of the Pacific Northwest was not merely passive surveillance equipment. It was possibly a behavioural management system, a system that kept the population moving in patterns that avoided the most densely populated areas, that discouraged habitation of certain territories and encouraged it in others, that maintained the appearance of a wild and unmanaged wilderness while exercising, at a level invisible to everyone outside the classified clearance structure. A soft but persistent influence over the lives of a population that did not know it was being managed. Mason drove back to Montana in the late spring of 2004. He drove back to the ridge above the Montana facility site, to the place where he had made his camp the previous year. He had, in the month since the first trip, spent considerable time with the acoustic monitoring documentation he had been able to reconstruct, and he had built, with the electronic expertise that was his primary skill, a device that could generate a signal on the tracking frequency. Not a full transmission, nothing that would activate the monitoring network's response systems, but a brief, localized pulse that he thought of, with a dark humour that was characteristic of his thinking as a knock on the door. He set up his camp in the same location as before. He connected his device to a battery pack and ran the output through a speaker unit. At 11:15 in the evening, with the temperature dropping toward freezing and the stars clear above the canopy, he activated the device and transmitted a brief pulse on the tracking frequency. Then he turned it off. He sat in the silence that followed and waited. The forest was quiet for a long time, not the ordinary quiet of a late spring night in the Montana mountains, with its constant subtle texture of wind and water and the small movements of small creatures. A different quiet, the particular quality of silence that a logging crew in Washington had noted 40 years earlier, that a ranger named Patricia Olson had noted in the 24 hours after filing her wildlife disturbance report, that Mason himself had experienced in the tree line outside this same camp the previous spring. Then, from deep in the valley below the ridge, from a distance he estimated at perhaps half a mile, perhaps more, there were 3 knocks. Not wood against wood, not the sound a woodpecker makes, or that a branch makes falling against another branch. 3 impacts, deliberate, rhythmically spaced, the sound carrying through the still air with a clarity that made the distance feel shorter than it was. A pause. The forest remained in its particular silence. Then 3 knocks again, from the same location, the same rhythm, the same deliberate measured cadence that Mason had listened to on 47 audio recordings across the preceding months. He was pressing the record button on his camcorder when the image glitched. The monitor display dissolved into static for approximately 3 seconds and then resolved again. Whatever had been in the tree line at the far edge of the light cone during those 3 seconds was not there when the image cleared. The forest below the ridge was dark and still. The tracking device sat silent in his hands, and the silence that settled over the valley was the silence of something that had answered and then decided that an answer was enough. Later, working through the final fragments of the directory that he had not fully processed, Mason found a document that had been indexed at the very end of the archive structure, past the monitoring report and past the tracking frequency documentation, in a subfolder that his initial pass through the material had catalogued as empty. The document was brief, half a page. It was the fragment of an internal memo, undated, with the header information almost entirely redacted. What remained was a subject line and a few lines of body text. The subject line read, Silvanus Phase 2, Coexistence Monitoring. The body text, in the same flat bureaucratic register that the entire archive had maintained from the 1st October memo in 1983 through the surveillance report of 2001, stated that the subject population's continued existence within the monitoring corridor was considered consistent with current program objectives, that the coexistence framework was operational and performing within expected parameters, and that no change to the current management protocol was recommended at this time. The word coexistence was doing an extraordinary amount of work in that sentence, and Mason spent a long time with it. The program had started as a containment operation. Capture the anomaly, study it, classify it, control it. It had ended, or at least reached its visible conclusion, as something that called itself coexistence, but was in practice a managed surveillance regime imposed on a population that had no knowledge of its existence and no mechanism for consent or refusal. The species that had been living in the forests of the Pacific Northwest for 200,000 years was still there. It had survived the initial capture. It had survived the facility. It had survived the 1987 breach and the project's subsequent operational evolution. It was, according to the best evidence that Mason had been able to assemble and verify, still there, moving through the wilderness corridors of Idaho and Montana and British Columbia in patterns that reflected both its own nature and the invisible pressure of a surveillance and management system it could not perceive. The question that Mason could not resolve. The question that settled over him on that Montana ridge and remained with him as he drove back through the mountain passes and across the Idaho plateau and through the wet green of the Oregon approach to Portland was not whether it was real. He had crossed that threshold months ago, by increments of evidence that had accumulated past any point of rational denial. The question was what the reality meant for everyone who would encounter it without the archive, without the seismic data and the genetic sequencing reports and the behavioural observation logs and the surveillance reports. Everyone who had heard the wood knocks in the night and seen the silhouette between the trees and felt the infrasonic resonance in their chest and told themselves, because the alternative required a revision of everything they understood about the world they lived in, that there was surely another explanation. The forests were full of signals moving at frequencies that human ears could not perceive. The monitoring network hummed its ultrasonic management frequencies through the old-growth corridors. And somewhere in the valley below the ridge, somewhere in the darkness between the trees that had been growing since before the nation that now claimed to manage them had existed, something that was not quite human, and was not human, was moving through a world it had always known, carrying in whatever cognitive architecture 200,000 years of parallel evolution had built, some knowledge of what it was and where it was and what it meant that 3 knocks, sent out into the dark, had received an answer. We, still, here. The forests remember. The mountains hold their silence with a patience that outlasts bureaucracies and classification schedules, and the institutional memories of agencies whose names change while their functions persist. The seismic sensors still register the bipedal impact patterns in the remote corridors where no survey team has walked. The infrared satellites still pass over the Pacific Northwest on their scheduled orbital arcs, and still, in the data processed by analysts whose clearance levels are sufficient, return thermal signatures that the standard wildlife management interpretation cannot account for. The acoustic monitoring network still pulses its management frequencies through the canopy, still shapes the movement of a population that moves through the same territories it has inhabited since the ice retreated, and the forest returned, and the first ancestors of Specimen A found the deep green corridors of the northwestern mountains and understood them, in whatever way such understanding was available to them, as home. The logging crews have come and gone. The rangers rotate through their postings. The hikers who camp in the backcountry of the Olympic Peninsula and the Bitterroot Range and the British Columbia interior log their sightings in online databases maintained by enthusiast communities that the relevant agencies monitor with a professional attention that goes publicly unacknowledged. The footprints found in the mud of forest stream crossings are photographed and debated. The woodknocks are recorded on consumer audio equipment and analysed by amateur acousticians who get closer to the truth than they know. The stories accumulate in the way that true things accumulate when the mechanisms for their official acknowledgement are closed, imperfectly, incompletely, in fragments that gesture toward a whole that most people are not prepared to assemble. Project Silvanus was never officially terminated. Its budget line continued to appear, buried within the administrative structure of programs with generic names, through every federal budget cycle for which records exist. The Silvanus Continuity Office, the designation that appeared in the 2001 surveillance report and nowhere else in any public document, has never been identified in any official government organizational chart. The facility in northern Idaho has never been officially acknowledged. The 3 missing security personnel from the March 1987 incident have never been officially accounted for. The Olympic Peninsula grid closure in October of 1983 has never been officially explained. Patricia Olson kept her journal until she died. Gerald Harwick, who worked the logging routes of the Olympic Peninsula for 6 more years after October of 1983, never publicly discussed what he saw that morning in the fog. But the people who knew him noted that he was careful, in the years that followed, never to work in the sections of the forest that he had marked on a private map he kept folded in his work jacket. Not because he was afraid, but because he had decided in the 4 to 6 seconds that the fog had cleared that whatever he had seen had as much right to those sections of forest as he did, and that the respectful thing to do was to acknowledge, even if only privately and without explanation, that some territories are not his to enter. The tracking frequency that Mason Klein documented, and the acoustic monitoring network he reconstructed from the technical fragments in the archive, continue to operate. He confirmed this through a series of signal monitoring exercises he conducted over the 2 years following his Montana expedition, using equipment that had improved considerably since his initial work with the directory. The frequencies were there, persistent, regular, embedded in the radio environment of the national forests like a signal that has been running so long that the people who monitor it have forgotten that it was ever not running. The population, between 37 and 62 individuals, as estimated by the 2001 surveillance report, has presumably changed in composition in the 20-plus years since that estimate was made. Populations change. They grow or they contract depending on conditions that include, for any species, the pressure of external management and the resilience of internal social structure. Whether the coexistence monitoring framework has been a stabilising or destabilising force on that population is not a question that any document in the archive answers, because the archive was compiled by people whose perspective on the matter was entirely one-directional. The monitor did not write documents, the managed did not file reports, the tagged did not know they were tagged. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks again. The valley holds the sound for a moment and then releases it, lets it travel up through the cold air to the ridge where someone might be sitting with a recording device, might be sitting with a signal transmitter, might be sitting with nothing but the particular quality of attention that some people bring to the wilderness night when they have stopped performing certainty about what the world contains. The sound reaches them. The forest closes behind it. The silence returns, full and particular. The silence that is not absence but attention. The silence of something very old and very patient that has been here longer than the names we have for it, and that will be here, in all likelihood, longer than the systems we've built to manage what we do not understand. The files exist somewhere. The frequencies persist. The population moves through its corridors, and the question that no classification level has been sufficient to resolve, the question that drives the program and its successors and its shadows forward through decade after decade of institutional continuity, is not whether they are real. It is whether, when the moment finally comes that the bureaucratic architecture can no longer contain the evidence, we will be capable of understanding what the 3 syllables mean. Not as an artifact of behavioural research, not as a data point in a surveillance report, but as what they have always been, a statement of fact offered across whatever distance separates us from what we share this world with, to anyone willing to be still enough in the dark to hear it. We, still, hear, and the recording runs, and the forests hold their silence, and somewhere below the ridge, in the deep green dark that has been home to something we almost understood and then decided we preferred to manage, the trees absorb the frequency, and the night goes on as it has always gone on, patient and full and entirely indifferent to whether we are ready for the truth of what moves within it. Before we begin, happy holidays to everyone listening. Whether you're spending time with family, travelling, or just enjoying some downtime with a mystery story, we're grateful you're here. A huge thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this story. We love hearing your ideas, and this one is absolutely perfect for the channel. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review means the world to us. And if you want, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. If you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that refuse to stay buried, hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get into tonight's story. There are certain minds throughout history that seem to exist outside the boundaries of their own time. Individuals whose understanding of the world appears so advanced, so impossibly ahead of their contemporaries, that we're left with an uncomfortable question. How? Leonardo da Vinci is perhaps the most striking example. A man born in the middle of the 15th century who sketched helicopters, who designed submarines, who understood human anatomy with a precision that wouldn't be matched for 300 years, who wrote in mirror image as if deliberately hiding something, who kept thousands of pages of notes that he never published, never shared, and in many cases never even explained. The traditional narrative tells us he was simply a genius, a once-in-a-millennium mind. But what if that's not the whole story? What if Leonardo wasn't inventing these ideas at all? What if he was preserving them, recording knowledge that came from somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere we're not supposed to know about? Tonight we're going to explore a possibility that historians have quietly debated for centuries. That Leonardo da Vinci didn't just happen to be brilliant, that he had access to something. Knowledge that predated him by hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. Information that was never meant to see the light of day. This is the story of the man who knew too much. Chapter 1. The Historical Leonardo. To understand the conspiracy, we first need to understand the man. Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci was born on April 15th in the year 1452, in the small Tuscan hill town of Vinci, in what was then the Republic of Florence. He was the illegitimate son of a notary and a peasant woman. His birth circumstances meant he couldn't follow in his father's footsteps into the legal profession. He couldn't attend university. He was, by the standards of his time, an outsider from the beginning. And yet, this outsider would become one of the most influential figures in human history. Leonardo was largely self-educated. He learned through observation, through apprenticeship, through his own relentless curiosity about how the world worked. At 14, he entered the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio in Florence, one of the leading artists of the Renaissance. There he learned painting, sculpture, metalworking, and the technical arts. But Leonardo's interest went far beyond art. He studied anatomy by dissecting corpses. He designed war machines for the Duke of Milan. He created elaborate stage sets for court performances. He investigated the nature of light, water, geology, and flight. He was an artist, yes, but also an engineer, an anatomist, an architect, a mathematician, a physicist before physics had a name, and he documented everything. Leonardo kept notebooks, thousands of pages of them, dense, meticulous records of his observations, sketches, theories, and designs. These weren't journals in the traditional sense. They were repositories of knowledge, technical manuals for inventions that wouldn't exist for centuries, anatomical studies that rivaled modern medical textbooks, mathematical proofs, engineering schematics, all recorded in his distinctive mirror writing flowing from right to left across the page. During his lifetime, almost none of this was published. Almost none of it was shared. Leonardo worked on commission for wealthy patrons. He painted, he built, he advised. But the contents of his notebooks, those remained private. The question is why? Why would someone with such groundbreaking insights keep them hidden? Why would a man who could have revolutionized medicine, engineering, and physics choose instead to lock his knowledge away in coded script? The official answer is simple. Leonardo was a perfectionist. He rarely finished projects. He moved from obsession to obsession. He planned to publish his findings eventually, but ran out of time. But there's another possibility, one that's far more unsettling. What if Leonardo was protecting something? What if he understood that the knowledge he possessed was dangerous, that it came from a source he couldn't publicly acknowledge? Chapter 2. The notebooks that were never meant to be read. Let's talk about the mirror writing. If you've ever seen a page from Leonardo's notebooks, you know what I'm talking about. Every word written backwards, readable only when held up to a mirror, thousands upon thousands of pages, all in this reverse script. The standard explanation is that Leonardo was left-handed, and mirror writing was simply more convenient for him. It prevented smudging, it felt more natural, nothing sinister about it. But consider this, Leonardo could write normally when he wanted to, letters to patrons, official correspondence, public-facing documents, all written in standard left-to-right script. He had the ability. He chose not to use it for his private work. Why deliberately make your own notes harder to read? The conspiracy theory suggests that Leonardo was encoding his knowledge, making it inaccessible to casual observers, ensuring that only someone with intent, with time, with purpose, could decipher what he'd written. This wasn't convenience, it was concealment. And when you look at what those notebooks contain, the idea of concealment starts to make sense. Leonardo's notebooks include designs for a helicopter-like aerial screw that uses rotating blades to achieve lift. This is 400 years before the Wright brothers would achieve powered flight. An armoured vehicle, essentially a tank with a protective shell and rotating cannons. This concept wouldn't be realised until World War I. A submarine, a diving suit, underwater breathing apparatus, all sketched in detail with notes on how they might function. Parachutes, ball bearings, hydraulic pumps, machines for excavating canals, weapons of war that resemble modern artillery. These aren't vague ideas, they're technical blueprints, many of them functional, many of them buildable even with Renaissance technology, had anyone understood what they were looking at. But here's what's truly strange. Leonardo never built most of these devices himself, never tested them, never promoted them. He drew them, made notes about them, and then moved on. It's as if he was cataloguing something, recording information for future reference. Not inventing, but documenting, preserving knowledge that already existed somewhere else. Now, let's get specific. In the Codex Atlanticus, there's a page, folio 308 recto, that shows a design for what Leonardo called a self-propelled cart. It's essentially an automobile, spring-driven, with steering mechanisms and braking systems. Modern engineers at the Museum of the History of Science in Florence actually built this design. It worked. Perfectly. A car in the year 1500. How did Leonardo know the precise ratios needed for the gears? How did he understand the mechanics of energy storage and release? This wasn't guesswork. The mathematics are exact. On folio 860 verso of the same codex, there's a design for ball bearings, spheres captured between two rings to reduce friction. This concept wouldn't appear in patent offices until the 1700s, 2 centuries after Leonardo drew it. He didn't just sketch these devices, he understood the physics, the engineering principles, the materials needed. It's as if he had a textbook from the future sitting in front of him. Chapter 3. Forbidden Anatomy. In Leonardo's time, the human body was a mystery. Medical knowledge was based largely on the writings of ancient Greek physicians like Galen, who had worked over 1,000 years earlier. Actual human dissection was rare, controversial, and in many cases forbidden by the Church. Leonardo didn't care. Between the late 1480s and 1511, Leonardo dissected approximately 30 human corpses. He did this in secret, often at night, working by candlelight in morgues and hospitals. The bodies were criminals, paupers, people who wouldn't be missed. Leonardo would spend hours, sometimes days, carefully opening them up, studying their inner workings, and sketching what he found. The results were extraordinary. Leonardo's anatomical drawings are so accurate that they're still used in medical education today. His sketches of the human heart show the chambers, the valves, the vessels with photographic precision. His studies of the spine reveal details about vertebrae and muscle attachments that weren't officially documented until the 19th century. His drawings of a fetus in the womb are so detailed, so correct, that they look like they could have come from a modern ultrasound. How? How does someone with no formal medical training working with rudimentary tools achieve this level of understanding? The official story is that Leonardo was simply that observant, that meticulous, that brilliant. But there's another interpretation. What if Leonardo already knew what he was supposed to find? What if he wasn't discovering the structure of the human body but confirming it, comparing what he saw on the dissection table with knowledge he'd acquired elsewhere? Some researchers have suggested that Leonardo may have had access to lost medical texts, ancient manuscripts from Egypt, Greece, or the Middle East that contained anatomical knowledge more advanced than what was publicly available in Renaissance Europe. These texts might have been suppressed, hidden away in private collections or monastery libraries, accessible only to those with the right connections. Leonardo had connections, wealthy patrons, powerful friends, access to libraries and scholars across Italy and France. If there were forbidden texts circulating in underground intellectual networks, Leonardo would have been in a position to see them. And if those texts revealed truths about the human body that contradicted church doctrine, well, you'd keep that to yourself, wouldn't you? You'd verify it quietly, record it in mirror writing, and never speak of it publicly, because the alternative would be heresy, prosecution, possibly death. Let's examine a specific example. In the Royal Collection at Windsor Castle, there's a series of drawings Leonardo made around 1510 showing the heart and its blood vessels. What's remarkable is that Leonardo correctly identified the aortic valve and understood its function in preventing backflow. He even noted that the valve has 3 cusps, not 2 as Galen had claimed. But here's the thing, Leonardo couldn't have observed this just by dissection. The heart stops beating when someone dies. The blood drains. You can't see the valve in action. You can't watch it open and close. Yet Leonardo drew it functioning. He understood the hydraulics of blood flow through a living heart. How? Modern researchers suggest he may have used glass models, filling them with water to observe flow patterns. That's possible. But it doesn't explain how he knew what pattern to expect in the first place. How he knew to build the model with 3 cusps instead of 2. How he knew the precise shape and angle needed for the valve to function. Unless he'd read about it somewhere. Unless someone, sometime, had documented this before. Chapter 4. The Missing Years. Here's where things get interesting. Leonardo's biography has gaps. Significant periods where we have little to no documentation of where he was or what he was doing. Historians have attempted to fill these gaps with educated guesses, but the truth is, we don't know. For example, between 1476 and 1478, Leonardo essentially disappears from the historical record. He's no longer listed in Verrocchio's workshop. He hasn't yet established his own studio. Where was he? What was he doing? Again in 1482 there's a gap. Leonardo is supposed to be in Milan, but documentation is thin. Letters are missing, commissions are vague, and then there are the unexplained trips. Leonardo travelled extensively throughout Italy and France. Some of these journeys are well documented, others are mysteries. Why did he go to certain cities? Who did he meet with? What was he studying? The conspiracy theory suggests that these missing years weren't empty at all, that Leonardo was working on classified projects, commissions from secret patrons who couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Or perhaps he was travelling to access restricted libraries, meeting with members of hidden societies, learning from sources that history has conveniently forgotten. Consider this. During these gaps, Leonardo's style and knowledge seem to shift. He returns from these periods with new techniques, new ideas, sudden leaps in a understanding that can't easily be explained by gradual development. It's as if he went somewhere and learned something. But what? And from whom? There's a curious detail in one of Leonardo's notebooks, the Codex Arundel, page 270. It's a list of books Leonardo wanted to acquire or had read. Among the titles are several works that shouldn't have been available in Renaissance Italy. Byzantine texts, Arabic treatises on optics and mathematics, books that were supposedly lost when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. How did Leonardo even know these books existed? How did he get access to them? One possibility is the Medici Library in Florence. The Medici family had agents throughout the Mediterranean, constantly searching for ancient manuscripts. They recovered texts from monasteries, private collections, even looted them from conquered cities. The library was vast, containing thousands of works, many of them never catalogued, never made public. Leonardo had connections to the Medici. He worked for them on and off throughout his career. He would have had access. But there's another possibility, one that takes us into darker territory. What if Leonardo was part of a network? A chain of knowledge keepers who passed information from generation to generation, preserving ancient wisdom that was too dangerous to publish openly. Chapter 5. The Art That Speaks in Symbols. Leonardo's paintings are among the most analysed artworks in human history, and for good reason. They're not just beautiful, they're strange, filled with anomalies, hidden details, and symbolic elements that have puzzled scholars for centuries. Take the Last Supper, painted between 1495 and 1498, on the wall of a monastery dining hall in Milan. On the surface, it's a straightforward depiction of Jesus and his 12 apostles at the moment Christ announces that one of them will betray him. But look closer. The composition is built on precise mathematical proportions. The perspective lines converge exactly on Christ's head. The spacing of the figures follows geometric patterns that wouldn't be formalised in art theory for another 100 years. Some researchers claim to have found musical notation hidden in the positions of the bread and hands of the apostles. Play it back, and you get a brief, haunting melody. Then there's the figure to Christ's right. Traditionally identified as John the Apostle, this figure has soft features, long hair, and a distinctly feminine appearance. This has spawned countless theories, most famously the idea popularised by modern conspiracy theorists that this is actually Mary Magdalene, and that Leonardo was encoding a secret about Christ's marriage and bloodline. Whether or not you believe that specific theory, the question remains, why paint John this way? Why introduce ambiguity into a scene that should be theologically clear? Unless the ambiguity was the point, unless Leonardo was deliberately leaving clues, breadcrumbs for those who knew how to look. But let's go deeper. Let's talk about something most people don't notice. In the Last Supper there are exactly 13 loaves of bread visible on the table. Not 12. 13. In Christian symbolism, 12 represents the apostles. 13 represents betrayal, bad luck, the number of people at the table including Judas. But here's the thing. There are also 13 figures in the painting. Christ and 12 apostles. So why 13 loaves? Why the duplication? Some researchers believe Leonardo was encoding a double meaning, that he was suggesting there were 13 initiates, not 12, that someone at that table wasn't who they appeared to be, that the traditional story is incomplete. Then there's the positioning of the hands. Every figure in the Last Supper has their hands visible except for one. There's a hand reaching toward a bread roll that doesn't clearly belong to any figure. It's disembodied. Anonymous. Whose hand is it? Why is it there? Leonardo was obsessive about detail. He wouldn't make a mistake like this, which means it's intentional, a symbol, a message. Now let's talk about the Mona Lisa, painted sometime between 1503 and 1506, the most famous painting in the world, and one of the most mysterious. Who is she? The official identification is Lisa Gherardini, wife of a Florentine merchant. But Leonardo never delivered the painting to whoever commissioned it. He kept it with him for the rest of his life, continuously working on it, refining it, never considering it finished. Why? The painting is full of oddities. The background landscapes on the left and right don't match. They're at different elevations, as if depicting two different worlds. The smile is famously ambiguous. The eyes seem to follow you. The entire composition has an otherworldly quality, as if the subject exists outside of normal time and space. Some theorists believe the Mona Lisa is a self-portrait, Leonardo in feminine form, a meditation on duality, hidden identity, the fluidity of self. Others think it's a coded representation of esoteric knowledge, the landscape symbolizing the hermetic principle of as above, so below, the smile representing hidden wisdom, accessible only to initiates. But here's something most people don't know. In 2005, researchers at the University of Amsterdam used digital analysis to examine the Mona Lisa's eyes. They found tiny letters and numbers painted in the pupils. In the right eye, the letters V, Leonardo Vinci, his signature, hidden where no one would look. But in the left eye, different symbols, possibly the letters C, E or B, or numbers. The resolution isn't clear enough to say for certain. Why hide symbols in the eyes of your subject? What message are you encoding? And it doesn't stop there. Analysis of the painting using infrared and ultraviolet light has revealed that Leonardo painted, erased, and repainted sections multiple times. There are layers beneath the visible surface, earlier versions of the face, different expressions, different details. It's as if he was trying to get something exactly right, capture something specific, encode something that could only be understood by someone who knew what to look for. What we know for certain is this: Leonardo treated this painting differently than any of his other works. He guarded it, obsessed over it, refused to let it go. That suggests it meant something more to him than just another commission. It was personal, it was important, it was a message. Chapter 6: Leonardo and Secret Societies. Renaissance Italy was a cauldron of intellectual ferment. This was the age of rediscovery. Ancient Greek and Roman texts were being translated and distributed. Hermetic philosophy, astrology, alchemy and mysticism were all experiencing a revival. Scholars were asking dangerous questions about the nature of reality, the structure of the cosmos and humanity's place in it. And they were doing it quietly, because the church was watching. Secret societies weren't exactly secret, but they were discreet. Groups of intellectuals, artists and nobles who met to discuss ideas that couldn't be spoken about publicly. Proto-Masonic organizations, hermetic circles, alchemical fraternities. These groups preserved and transmitted knowledge that was considered heretical or dangerous. Did Leonardo have connections to these networks? There's no smoking gun, no membership roster with his name on it, but there are suggestions, coincidences, overlaps. Leonardo's patron in Milan, Ludovico Sforza, was known to support esoteric scholars. The Medici family in Florence, who also employed Leonardo, had extensive libraries filled with hermetic and alchemical texts. Leonardo moved in these circles. He had access, and his notebooks contain references to concepts that align with hermetic philosophy. The idea of microcosm and macrocosm, the interconnectedness of all things, the belief that nature operates according to hidden mathematical laws that, if understood, could unlock tremendous power. Leonardo once wrote, "Learn how to see, realize that everything connects to everything else." That's not just artistic philosophy, that's hermetic doctrine. But let's get specific. There's a group that historians know existed in 15th century Florence called the Platonic Academy. Founded by Cosimo de' Medici and led by the philosopher Marsilio Ficino, this academy was dedicated to studying and translating ancient Greek texts, particularly the works of Plato and the Hermetic Corpus. The Hermetic Corpus is a collection of writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary figure believed to have lived in ancient Egypt and possessed divine knowledge. These texts discuss alchemy, astrology, and the hidden structure of the universe. They were rediscovered in the West in the mid-1400s and caused a sensation among intellectuals. Leonardo lived in Florence during the height of the Platonic Academy's influence. He worked for the Medici. He knew Ficino and other Academy members. It's virtually impossible that he wasn't exposed to Hermetic ideas. But there's more. In Leonardo's notebooks there are sketches and diagrams that appear to be alchemical symbols. Circles within circles, geometric patterns, arrangements of elements that match known alchemical texts. On page 76, recto of the Codex Atlanticus, there's a drawing of a square inside a circle inside a triangle. This is a classic Hermetic symbol representing the relationship between earth, heaven, and divine fire. It's not just decorative. Leonardo has notes around it discussing proportions and ratios, as if he's using the symbol as a mathematical tool. Why would an artist and engineer be studying alchemical geometry unless he believed it had practical applications? Then there's the matter of the Vitruvian Man. one of Leonardo's most famous drawings. Created around 1490, it shows a male figure in two superimposed positions, arms and legs outstretched, inscribed within both a circle and a square. The official explanation is that Leonardo was illustrating the proportions of the human body as described by the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius. The drawing demonstrates that the human form embodies perfect mathematical ratios, but Hermetic scholars see something else. The Vitruvian man is a representation of the Hermetic principle that humans are microcosms of the universe, that the same proportions that govern the human body govern the cosmos, that by understanding ourselves we understand reality itself. Leonardo even wrote on the drawing, "Man is the model of the world." That's pure Hermetic philosophy, the idea that humanity contains within itself the keys to universal knowledge. Some researchers have suggested that Leonardo was part of a chain of knowledge transmission, that he was taught by someone who was taught by someone, going back through the centuries, preserving ancient wisdom that predated Christianity itself, Egyptian mysteries, Greek philosophy, Babylonian astronomy, knowledge that had been driven underground but never truly lost. If that's true, then Leonardo wasn't a lone genius. He was a guardian, a keeper of secrets, someone entrusted with preserving information until humanity was ready to receive it. But of course humanity might never be ready, and so the knowledge stays hidden, encoded in art, buried in notebooks, waiting. There's even a theory that connects Leonardo to the Knights Templar. The Templars were a medieval military order that operated during the Crusades. They were suppressed by the Church in the early 1300s, accused of heresy and devil worship. Most were arrested and executed, but legends persist that some escaped, taking with them vast treasures and secret knowledge they'd acquired in the Holy Land. Could that knowledge have been passed down through secret societies to Renaissance scholars like Leonardo? It's speculative, but consider this. The Templars were known to have extensive libraries. They had access to Arabic and Byzantine texts. They studied sacred geometry and architectural principles that they incorporated into their churches and castles. When the Templars were destroyed, their knowledge didn't just vanish. It went somewhere. Into hiding. Into networks of initiates who would preserve it across the centuries. Could Leonardo have been part of that chain? Could his notebooks contain fragments of Templar wisdom, encoded and hidden, waiting to be decoded by someone who understood the symbols? Chapter 7. Technology Too Early. Let's return to those inventions, the flying machines, the tanks, the submarines. These designs weren't fantasies. Modern engineers have built working models based on Leonardo's sketches, and many of them function exactly as he predicted. The aerial screw generates lift. The armoured vehicle moves and protects its occupants. The diving suit allows underwater exploration. Leonardo understood principles of aerodynamics, hydraulics, and mechanical engineering that wouldn't be formally articulated until the Industrial Revolution, 300 years after his death. How? The standard answer: observation and experimentation. Leonardo studied birds to understand flight. He watched water wheels to grasp hydraulic power. He was a keen observer of nature, and he extrapolated from what he saw. But here's the problem with that explanation. Leonardo didn't just observe nature and make educated guesses. He understood the underlying mathematics, the ratios, the force calculations, the material stresses. This wasn't trial and error. This was applied physics, and he was doing it centuries before Newton formalized the laws of motion, before Bernoulli explained fluid dynamics, before anyone had a theoretical framework for understanding how these machines should work. So where did that framework come from? The conspiracy theory suggests reverse engineering, that Leonardo had access to descriptions or even diagrams of technologies from an earlier, more advanced civilization, perhaps ancient texts from Alexandria before the library burned, perhaps artifacts recovered from archaeological sites, perhaps oral traditions passed down through secret societies. He wasn't inventing, he was reconstructing, taking fragmentary knowledge and trying to rebuild lost technologies. That would explain why so many of his designs were never built during his lifetime. He didn't have all the pieces. He was working from incomplete information, trying to fill in the gaps. Recording what he knew, hoping that future generations might finish what he started. It would also explain the secrecy. If Leonardo had stumbled upon evidence of an advanced prehistoric civilization, that would be profoundly dangerous. It would undermine the Church's timeline of human history. It would suggest that progress wasn't linear, that humanity had risen and fallen before, that the Renaissance wasn't a rebirth but a re-remembering. You don't publish that kind of revelation. You hide it, you encode it, and you hope someone in the future will understand. Let's examine a specific case. In the Codex Madrid, discovered in the Spanish National Library in 1967, there's a design for what Leonardo called a clockwork knight. It's a humanoid automaton, powered by springs and gears, capable of sitting, standing, moving its arms, and even moving its jaw. Modern roboticists at the Institute and Museum of the History of Science in Florence built this design. It worked. A functional robot, designed 500 years before the word robot was even invented. Leonardo didn't just draw this. He understood kinematics, the study of motion. He knew about gear ratios, mechanical advantage, and energy storage. These concepts weren't formalized until the 17th and 18th centuries. How did a Renaissance artist know robotics? Unless he didn't invent it. Unless he was copying it from something older. There's a legend, mostly dismissed by mainstream historians, that during the Crusades, European knights encountered ancient automata in the Middle East. Mechanical devices left over from Greek and Roman times, or possibly even older. These automata supposedly demonstrated technological sophistication that medieval Europeans couldn't explain. Some of these devices might have been brought back to Europe, studied, documented, and then, when the Church cracked down on anything that smacked of pagan or heretical knowledge, hidden away. Could Leonardo have seen one of these ancient machines? Could he have studied it, taken it apart and recorded how it worked? It's impossible to prove, but it would explain a lot. Then there's the matter of Leonardo's flying machines. He designed several different types. The aerial screw, which resembles a helicopter, an ornithopter with flapping wings, a glider with fixed wings. Each design shows sophisticated understanding of aerodynamic principles. Leonardo filled pages with calculations about lift, drag, and weight ratios. He understood that you needed a certain wing area to support a certain mass. He knew about the relationship between air pressure and altitude. He even speculated about something resembling jet propulsion, though he couldn't build it with available technology. This is centuries before the Bernoulli principle would explain how wings generate lift, before anyone understood the physics of flight. Leonardo wrote in his notebooks, "A bird is an instrument working according to mathematical law. It lies within the power of man to reproduce this instrument with all its movements." He didn't say, "I am inventing flight." He said, "reproduce," as if flight had existed before, as if he was recreating something that had been lost. What if ancient civilizations had achieved flight? What if there were texts, legends, or artifacts that described or depicted flying machines, and Leonardo had access to them? It sounds far-fetched. But ancient Sanskrit texts from India describe vimanas, flying vehicles used by gods and kings. These descriptions are detailed, mentioning propulsion systems, navigation, and even weapons. Mainstream scholars dismiss these as mythology, but what if they weren't entirely fictional? What if they preserved memories of real technologies, distorted by time but containing kernels of truth? Leonardo had access to the Medici library, which contained texts from across the ancient world. He could read Latin and some Greek. He had contacts with scholars who translated Arabic and Sanskrit manuscripts. If descriptions of ancient flying machines existed anywhere in Europe, Leonardo might have found them. And if he did, he would have done exactly what his notebooks show, tried to figure out how they worked, tried to rebuild them, tried to preserve that knowledge for the future. Chapter 8. The knowledge he never released. Here's one of the most puzzling aspects of Leonardo's life: his refusal to finish things. He started more projects than he completed. Paintings left unfinished, sculptures abandoned, engineering designs sketched but never built, anatomical treatises planned but never compiled. and crucially, he never published his notebooks. During the Renaissance, the printing press was revolutionizing information distribution. Books were being produced and circulated at an unprecedented rate. If Leonardo had wanted to share his knowledge, he could have. He could have become one of the most influential scientific authors of his age, but he didn't. Even when opportunities presented themselves, even when patrons encouraged him, even when scholars begged for access to his findings, Leonardo held back. He made excuses, promised future publications that never materialized, kept his notebooks private. Why? The conspiracy theory offers a chilling explanation. Leonardo feared what would happen if his knowledge fell into the wrong hands. Look at the military technologies he designed. Weapons of incredible destructive power. Machines that could change the nature of warfare. If these had been built and deployed during the constant conflicts of Renaissance Italy, the devastation would have been catastrophic. Leonardo may have realized this. He may have understood that humanity wasn't ready, that the knowledge he possessed, while fascinating, was also dangerous, that it needed to be preserved for the future but kept away from the present. There's evidence to support this. In his notebooks, Leonardo writes about his reluctance to publish certain findings. He expresses concern about how his inventions might be used. He notes that some knowledge should be withheld for the benefit of mankind. This isn't the attitude of someone who just never got around to finishing things. This is deliberate restraint, conscious suppression. Leonardo was sitting on a powder keg of revolutionary ideas, and he chose not to light the fuse. The question is, did he make that choice alone? Or was he following instructions? Adhering to the rules of some organization or tradition that demanded knowledge be parcelled out slowly, carefully, only when the time was right? In the Codex Leicester, Leonardo writes about a discovery he made regarding fossils and geological formations. He understood that fossil seashells found on mountain tops meant those mountains had once been underwater. He understood geological time, the idea that the Earth was millions of years old, not thousands as the Church taught. This was heretical, dangerous. If Leonardo had published this, he would have been accused of contradicting Scripture. But instead of keeping silent, instead of destroying this knowledge, Leonardo recorded it, preserved it, in mirror writing, for someone in the future to find. He wrote, "The number of years during which the Mediterranean was being formed is to be seen in the thickness of the sediments, which could not have been deposited in less time. That's geology. That's deep time. That's a complete rejection of biblical chronology. And Leonardo knew it. He even wrote, almost apologetically, 'Here there is room for more extended discourse, but the brevity to which I am constrained prevents me.' Translation: I have more to say, but I can't. Not now, not safely." This pattern repeats throughout Leonardo's notebooks. Revolutionary insights, followed by hesitation. Bold claims, followed by restraint. As if he's constantly aware that he's walking a tightrope between preserving truth and protecting himself. It suggests Leonardo was part of something bigger, that he understood his role as a keeper of knowledge, not a disseminator, that there were rules about what could be shared and what had to remain hidden, and those rules may have come from a tradition much older than Leonardo himself. Chapter 9: Death and Disappearance. Leonardo da Vinci died on May 2nd, 1519 in Amboise, France. He was 67 years old. He spent his final years in the service of King Francis I of France, living in a manor house called Clos Lucé, still working, still sketching, still pursuing the mysteries that had consumed his life. According to legend, Leonardo died in the arms of the king, though historians doubt this actually happened. What we know for certain is that he was failing for months before his death. His right hand was partially paralysed, possibly from a stroke. He could still draw and write with his left hand, but he knew his time was running out. In his final months, Leonardo destroyed some of his papers, burned them. Why? What did they contain that even he, on his deathbed, felt needed to be erased? When he died, he left behind thousands of pages of notebooks, but not all of them survived. His heir was Francesco Melzi, a devoted pupil who had worked with Leonardo for years. Melzi inherited the notebooks and took them back to Italy, where he attempted to organise them. perhaps prepare them for publication. But Melzi died in 1570, and after that the notebooks were scattered. Some were sold, some were stolen. Some were divided up among heirs who had no idea what they possessed. Pages were torn out. Entire volumes disappeared. Today we have perhaps half of what Leonardo originally created. Maybe less. The Codex Leicester, the Codex Atlanticus, the Windsor collection. These are the survivors, precious fragments of a much larger whole. But what about the rest? Where did those missing notebooks go? What did they contain? The conspiracy theory suggests that certain volumes were deliberately suppressed, that someone at some point recognised the dangerous knowledge they contained and removed them from circulation. Perhaps the church confiscated them. Perhaps a secret society reclaimed them. Perhaps they were destroyed. Or perhaps they're still out there, hidden in private collections, locked in vaults, waiting to be rediscovered. There are persistent rumours of lost Leonardo manuscripts. In the 1960s, 2 volumes of Leonardo's notebooks were discovered in the National Library of Spain. They'd been there for centuries, miscatalogued and forgotten. This discovery proved that major Leonardo works could remain hidden in plain sight for hundreds of years. If 2 volumes could hide in a public library, what might be concealed in private hands? There are stories, unconfirmed but persistent, of a Leonardo manuscript in the library of a German noble family, of pages supposedly held by the Vatican, never displayed, never catalogued, of a volume allegedly in the possession of a British collector who refuses to let anyone examine it. Are these real, or just wishful thinking? We don't know. But the fact remains, a significant portion of Leonardo's work is missing, and given the explosive nature of what we do have, it's worth asking what secrets might be in what we don't. Consider this. The notebooks that survived are the ones that were inherited by students, sold to collectors, eventually donated to libraries and museums. They're the public-facing notebooks, the ones Leonardo might have expected others to see. But what about his private notebooks, the ones he kept truly secret, the ones that contained his most dangerous ideas? If Leonardo was part of a knowledge-keeping tradition, if he had access to forbidden texts and ancient wisdom, he wouldn't have recorded that in notebooks he planned to pass on to students. He would have kept separate records, hidden records, accessible only to those who knew where to look, and when he died, those records would have been retrieved, not by his heirs, by others, by members of whatever organisation Leonardo served. That's speculation, but it fits the evidence. It explains why major gaps exist in Leonardo's work. It explains why certain topics he clearly studied, based on scattered notes and comments, have no dedicated treatises. It explains the pattern of suppression and concealment that runs through his entire life. Leonardo took secrets to his grave, but some of those secrets may not have died with him. They may have been passed on, quietly, through channels we can't trace. Chapter 10. Why the truth would be dangerous. Let's step back and consider what's at stake here. If Leonardo da Vinci really did have access to ancient advanced knowledge, the implications are staggering. First, it would mean that human history isn't what we think it is, that there were civilizations before ours, possibly far before, that achieved levels of sophistication we're only now beginning to match, that history is cyclical, not linear, that we've been here before. This idea terrifies institutions. It undermines narratives of progress. It suggests that everything we've built could collapse, just as it has before, that we're not ascending towards some inevitable enlightenment, but cycling through patterns of rise and fall that stretch back into prehistory. The Church, during Leonardo's time and for centuries after, insisted on a specific timeline. Creation occurred roughly 4,000 years before Christ. Human history was short, recent, and centred on biblical events. Anything that contradicted this was heresy. If Leonardo had evidence of ancient advanced civilizations that predated biblical chronology, he couldn't say so. Not publicly. The Inquisition was real. People were burned for less. Second, it would mean that institutions we trust, religious and secular, have been hiding this truth. That the story we're told about human development, progress, The rise of civilization is incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst. Think about what mainstream history teaches. Humans evolved slowly. Civilization began in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago. Progress has been gradual, building on previous generations, leading inexorably to our current state of development. But what if that's wrong? What if there were earlier civilizations that rose to great heights, then collapsed catastrophically? What if knowledge was lost in those collapses, only to be partially recovered later? What if Leonardo had access to fragments of that lost knowledge? It would mean that human potential is far greater than we've been told, that our ancestors were capable of things we don't give them credit for, that the ancient world wasn't primitive but sophisticated in ways we're only beginning to understand. And that raises uncomfortable questions. If ancient civilizations were advanced, why did they fall? What mistakes did they make? Are we making the same mistakes now? Third, it would mean that there are people, groups, organizations who have known this truth and chosen to keep it secret for centuries, perhaps millennia, controlling what we know, when we know it, ensuring that the masses remain ignorant while the initiated preserve the real knowledge. This is the part that really unsettles people, the idea that history is managed, that knowledge is rationed, that there's an elite class of keepers who decide what humanity gets to know and when. If Leonardo was part of such a group, he was following their rules, recording information but not releasing it, preserving knowledge for future generations while keeping it hidden from his own. Why would anyone do that? The benevolent interpretation is that they're protecting humanity. That knowledge can be dangerous if released at the wrong time, that societies need to be ready, mature enough, wise enough, before they can handle certain truths. The sinister interpretation is that they're maintaining power, that keeping the masses ignorant ensures control, that the initiated remain special, privileged, elevated above others by their access to hidden wisdom. Which is it, or is it both? We may never know. But the pattern is undeniable. Throughout history, there have been individuals who knew more than they said, who hinted at secrets they couldn't reveal, who left cryptic messages for those who came after. Leonardo was one of them, and he wasn't alone. That's not the kind of revelation that gets a warm reception. Religious authorities would resist it because it challenges creation narratives and timelines. Political authorities would resist it because it undermines their claims to legitimacy and progress. Academic authorities would resist it because it invalidates entire fields of study. The truth, if this conspiracy is real, would be profoundly destabilizing, and so it gets buried, ridiculed, dismissed as fantasy. Leonardo becomes a genius, yes, but a safe genius, an individual anomaly, one brilliant mind in a sea of medieval ignorance. We celebrate his art, marvel at his inventions, and carefully avoid asking the harder questions, like, where did he really learn all of this? Who taught him? What did he know that we still don't? The genius narrative is comfortable. It doesn't threaten anything. It confirms our belief in human potential, in individual achievement, and the gradual march of progress. But what if Leonardo's genius wasn't individual at all? What if it was inherited, transmitted, part of a vast underground river of knowledge that flows beneath the surface of recorded history, occasionally breaking through in the work of people like him? That's a much more unsettling story, and perhaps that's exactly why it's been suppressed. Chapter 11, The Others Who Knew. Leonardo wasn't the only Renaissance figure with impossible knowledge. He had contemporaries and successors who displayed similar patterns, knowledge that shouldn't exist, abilities that can't be explained, secrets encoded in their work. Take Filippo Brunelleschi, the architect who designed the dome of Florence Cathedral. Completed in 1436, this dome was an engineering marvel. It was the largest dome built since antiquity, and Brunelleschi achieved it using techniques that baffled his contemporaries. He used a double-shell design, with an inner and outer dome separated by a gap. He employed herringbone brick patterns that distributed weight in ways Roman engineers would have recognised, but medieval builders had forgotten. He built the dome without scaffolding, using a self-supporting structure that seemed to defy gravity. How did Brunelleschi know how to do this? The official story is that he studied ancient Roman buildings, particularly the Pantheon in Rome, and figured out their construction methods through observation and experimentation. But here's the thing, the Pantheon's construction techniques were lost. The Romans used concrete formulas that medieval Europe didn't possess. The engineering knowledge required to build such structures had vanished. Yet Brunelleschi rediscovered it. Or did he? What if he had access to Roman texts that described these methods? Texts that weren't supposed to exist. Leonardo knew Brunelleschi's work. They were both in Florence, and Leonardo studied the dome extensively. Did Brunelleschi pass something on to Leonardo? Did they share access to the same sources? Then there's Nikola Tesla, much later, but worth mentioning for the parallels. Tesla, working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, invented alternating current, wireless communication, and designs for energy transmission that are still not fully understood. Tesla claimed his ideas came to him in visions, that he would see complete functional devices in his mind and simply record them. He rarely built prototypes, working almost entirely from mental imagery. Sound familiar? Leonardo also claimed to work from vision, from inspiration, from sources he couldn't fully explain. Tesla died in 1943. When he died, the FBI raided his hotel room and confiscated all his papers. Many of those papers have never been released. To this day, portions of Tesla's work remain classified. Why? What did Tesla know? What was he working on that the government deemed too dangerous to share? The pattern repeats. Individuals throughout history who possess knowledge beyond their time, who leave cryptic notes, who hint at secrets they can't fully reveal, who die with their most important work unfinished or suppressed. Are these isolated geniuses, or are they part of something connected? A chain of knowledge keepers stretching across centuries? Even Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics, had secrets. Newton spent decades studying alchemy, writing more about transmutation and mystical philosophy than about gravity and motion. He believed in hidden knowledge, in ancient wisdom encoded in biblical texts and hermetic writings. When Newton died, his alchemical manuscripts were deemed too embarrassing for a man of science and were hidden away. They weren't seriously studied until the 20th century. What was Newton looking for in those texts? What did he think the ancients knew? The conspiracy theory suggests that all of these figures, Leonardo, Brunelleschi, Newton, Tesla and others, were tapping into the same source. A body of ancient knowledge preserved through secret traditions, accessible to those who knew where to look and who to ask. If that's true, the implications are extraordinary. It means human knowledge isn't linear. It means we've lost more than we've gained. It means the ancients might have understood reality in ways we're only beginning to rediscover. And it means Leonardo's notebooks aren't anomalies. They're pieces of a much larger puzzle. Epilogue. The last question. Leonardo da Vinci once wrote, "Learning never exhausts the mind." It's a simple statement, optimistic, encouraging, the kind of thing you'd expect from someone who dedicated his life to understanding the world. But in the context of everything we've discussed tonight, it takes on a different meaning. What if Leonardo wasn't talking about learning as discovery? What if he was talking about learning as remembering? As reconnecting with knowledge that already exists, has always existed, waiting to be accessed by those capable of seeing it? Learning never exhausts the mind because the knowledge is already there, inside us, part of our heritage. We just have to remember. Leonardo may not have been ahead of his time at all. He may have been perfectly on time for a much longer timeline than we acknowledge. A timeline that includes rises and falls, golden ages and dark ages, civilizations that climbed to extraordinary heights and then collapsed, leaving behind only fragments. And maybe, just maybe, people like Leonardo are the ones who find those fragments, who piece together what was lost, who carry the torch through the darkness until humanity is ready to see clearly again. We celebrate Leonardo as an individual genius because that's a story we can accept. It doesn't challenge our worldview, it doesn't force us to reconsider everything we think we know about history, but the evidence suggests something else, something older, something hidden. Leonardo da Vinci had access to knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. He recorded it in code, he kept it secret, and when he died, much of it vanished. That's not the pattern of a lone genius. That's the pattern of a guardian, someone protecting something precious, something dangerous. The question we're left with is this. If Leonardo was preserving ancient knowledge, who else has done the same? How much of human achievement is actually human remembering, and what are we still forgetting? The notebooks that survive offer clues, but they're incomplete. Fragments of a larger truth that Leonardo took to his grave. Perhaps one day the missing pieces will surface, the lost manuscripts will be found, the full story will finally be told. Until then, we're left with mystery, with possibility, with the unsettling suggestion that everything we think we know about our past might be wrong. Leonardo da Vinci wasn't just a Renaissance man. He was a bridge, a connection to something we've lost, a reminder that human potential extends far beyond what we're willing to acknowledge. And if that makes you uncomfortable, if that challenges your understanding of reality, well, maybe that's exactly what Leonardo intended, because the truth isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it's hidden, encoded, waiting in mirror writing for someone brave enough to hold it up to the light. The question is, are you ready to see what's really there? There's one final detail worth mentioning. In Leonardo's very last notebook entry, written shortly before he died, he wrote something strange, something that doesn't fit with anything else in his work. He wrote, "We must continue what was begun so long ago." Continue what? Begun by whom? Leonardo never explained. And then he died. Those words have puzzled scholars for centuries. They don't refer to any specific project. They don't connect to any known commission or artwork. Unless Leonardo was talking about something else entirely, something bigger than any single project, a mission, a purpose, a sacred duty passed down through generations, to preserve what must not be lost, to remember what others have forgotten, to keep the light burning through the darkness. Leonardo fulfilled his part. He recorded what he could. He hid what he must. He left clues for those who would come after. Now it's up to us to decide what to do with them, to see what Leonardo saw, to ask the questions he couldn't ask openly, to continue what was begun so long ago. Sleep well. And remember, learning never exhausts the mind. It only reveals how much we've forgotten. And sometimes, just sometimes, it helps us remember what we never knew we knew.